As we discussed in the previous session, recruitment is the way that an organization invites members of the community to apply to become a volunteer. It is essential to getting talented volunteer pool that you require to support your organization and further its mission. Once volunteers are recruited and have shown interest in volunteering for the organization, they must go through a selection process. What is volunteer selection? Volunteer selection is the process of interviewing and selecting volunteers for admission into your organization's volunteer program. It may include an application process, an interview, submission of work samples, or a job knowledge assessment. In this installment, we will be focusing on the application process and interview. You may be wondering, why is proper selection of volunteers so important? There are several reasons that selecting the right volunteers is essential. One reason is for the organization's protection. Organizations may be held liable for their volunteers' actions within the regular duty of the volunteer position. In addition, it's in the organization's best interest to select volunteers which will be able to effectively perform the job functions that the organization has identified as necessary. Most importantly for the organization, it is essential to prevent vulnerable populations from being exposed to dangerous volunteers. The selection process is also important for the volunteers, offering them the opportunity to ensure that your organization is the right match for them. Also, a volunteer selection system can provide evidence of thoughtful volunteer selection, which can serve to make the organization look more thorough, safe, and professional to prospective volunteers. Now that you know what volunteer selection is and why it is so important, it is important to understand the current best practices in volunteer selection. We have identified the following best practices for volunteer selection. Develop an application process. Develop selection guidelines. Effectively train staff on volunteer selection processes. And utilize structured interviewing. Let's explore each best practice in detail. Number 1, develop an application process. First, an organization needs to develop an application process. This process should include forms that every prospective volunteer has to fill out, as well as a timeline for selection. Having an application form and process timeline adds legitimacy to the volunteer program and ensures that volunteers will all be treated equally. In addition, it's an important method of weeding out volunteers who are not truly committed to the organization, at least enough to spend the time filling out an application. As a part of the application process, organizations should have a strict timeline for returning phone calls and responding to new applications in a timely manner, typically within 24 to 48 hours of initial contact. Doing so legitimizes the organization's volunteer program, as well as adding needed professionalism. Number 2, develop selection guidelines. Next, it's important to develop selection guidelines that meet the organization's needs. Staff who manage volunteers, in conjunction with the volunteer manager, need to draft job descriptions for each volunteer position available. From these job descriptions, volunteer managers will need to make a list of the qualities that they are looking for in a volunteer, as well as the necessary skills and abilities. These guidelines will be utilized during the interview process. 3, staff training. If staff is going to be involved in the selection process, it's necessary to train them on the processes, duties, protocols, and regulations. All staff who will be taking part in the selection process will need to be trained on how to effectively interact with volunteers on a legal basis, as well as in a friendly manner to put your organization's best foot forward. Number 4, develop a structured interview method. Instead of using traditional interviewing, a more formal method of selecting volunteers called structured interviewing can achieve better selection results. Using structured interviews to select volunteers allows organizations to eliminate bias in the selection process while still interacting on a personal level with the interviewee. Structured interviewing has been found to be better at predicting a volunteer's ability to perform the job duties, as well as their overall success as a volunteer. Structured interviewing has 3 features that set it apart from the typical interview process. These are asking job-related questions only, having predetermined rating scales for the evaluation of answers, and consistently administering the interview for every applicant. Let's explore each feature in more detail. Job-related questions. In order to understand what questions a volunteer should answer, the volunteer manager should assemble a group of experts. These experts will have experience as staff members overseeing volunteers, or can be volunteers themselves, who regularly perform the duties of the position. This group's job is to create very specific questions which pertain directly to the job duties that have been identified as being necessary to the volunteer position. They may be situational, behavioral, or knowledge-based questions. No personal questions should be included, only job-related questions. This helps to eliminate bias in selection. The answers to the questions should not be obvious, but should really get at the volunteer's ability to do the job from the various aspects of the job duties. Predetermined rating scales. Next, before ever interviewing a volunteer, this previously mentioned group of organization volunteer experts sit down and develop not only the questions that every volunteer will be asked, but also how the responses will be rated. They should make a list of each potential answer that could be given to each question. From there, the responses are rated on a Likert scale, with specific responses aligned to each number, typically between 1 and 5. And finally, consistently administered. One of the most important aspects of a structured interview is that it is administered in the same way every time for every potential volunteer. Training must be done to teach staff how to effectively follow the prescribed interview structure and about the do's and don'ts of structured interviewing. In the end, structured interviewing is easy, facilitates decision-making, and provides for an easy and unbiased way of selecting volunteers from a large pool of applicants. It can also provide legal protection in case of a challenge. Now that you know more about utilizing structured interviewing in the selection of volunteers, let's discuss interview questions. As you interview, it's necessary to ask important and relevant questions. Having structured scoring and interviewing helps, but in case your organization does not, there are some legal implications. For example, questions not to ask include questions about nationality, religion, age, marital status, gender, physical ability, and/or military experience/status. Asking these questions could potentially put your organization in a liability issue. Some questions that you should ask include: describe a time when you had to work as a member of a team to complete a project. What are you hoping to gain from this volunteer experience? What experience do you have in this service area? And finally, do you know anyone personally affected by or connected to this service area? These questions allow you to get at the heart of the volunteer and what their interests are in the organization. Thank you for joining us. As you can see, volunteer screening is an important aspect of volunteer management. It helps you to reduce potential liability issues, ensure that you are getting the right volunteer into the right position based on their talents and abilities, and can help to grow internal capacity in a safe way. By following selection best practices like developing interview guidelines, and training staff to effectively select volunteers, and enacting consistent selection requirements, your organization can ensure the safe and proper selection of volunteers. Thank you for joining us as we discussed volunteer selection. Please join us for our next webinar in the series about volunteer screening and its importance in volunteer management.